my name is Chris Brook and I'm presenting the research paper Support for Online Students, specifically looking at reducing attrition, on behalf of my co-authors, Abhinav Maital and Amit Garga, both of LINC Education in Singapore. When exploring attrition in online learning in the Australian context, the Tertiary Education and Quality and Standards Agency in 2017 released data indicating that over 30% attrition rate for students studying online. This is significantly higher than the attrition rate of students studying face-to-face. With regard to our research, we were interested in looking at any student who enrolled and intended to complete a course, whether it was undergraduate or postgraduate, but did not complete that unit of study and did not re-enroll in subsequent semesters. We classed that as attrition. It included those students who enrolled and did not come to the very first lecture, right the way up to those students who attended but left before census date or left after census date. We were keen to look at any student who enrolled in a unit, whether it was postgraduate, undergraduate, mid-year intake, middle of year intake, and did not come to the very first lecture, or came to the first series of lectures and left before census, or attended right the way up to census and left after census date. This we termed MELT. We were keen to explore ways of reducing attrition in the notion that it would be good for the institution, because improved retention leads to improved completion rates, improved funding, improved reputation, and reduced risk with the Texas Education Quality and Standards Agency. No shortage of research which explores factors that influence attrition in higher education. Some of those reflect the student themselves, especially when we're looking at increased risk, student characteristics, whether someone's a verbal or a physical learning style, and whether they have a tendency toward procrastination. In developing our research, we were very keen to answer 3 questions, and that was to look at the influence that individualised telephone communication would have on student behaviour. We were very keen to look at ongoing tutor support and guidance and how that might influence attrition, whether it was MELT before census or after census. And we were very keen to see how that individualised guidance would influence unit completions and success. We adopted a use-inspired basic approach to our research, utilising qualitative and quantitative paradigms where appropriate. We adopted a multi-case study approach, utilising grounded theory to explore what was actually happening in the environment and then to try to make meaning from that. We had a case study approach, and our data collection included semi-structured interviews, observation, and questionnaires. We selected our tutors for this research project based on their qualifications and not necessarily their experience in teaching online. All the tutors either had a PhD or significant experience in the workplace. We gave them 25 hours of training in how to teach online. Tutors were given very strict guidelines in proactive support for students, early and ongoing communication with students individually, and that any student inquiry, whether it was by text, email, discussion board, or telephone, must be resolved within 60 minutes. We required our tutors to develop a customised dynamic engagement communication plan for each student based on their progress and upcoming academic milestones. Our first case study involved an online Master of Business Administration running over an intensive 7-week study period. It involved 552 students in the study period. When we explored the communication pattern of students, 4 clear groups formed. We had students who utilised the individual communication via the telephone or SMS messages only. We had students who used the learning management system, including discussion forums, as well as the individualised communication on a fairly regular basis. We had erratic users who used both, but only at certain times during the semester, and quite often only around the due date for assessments. And we had a group of students that we identified as disengaged from both learning support. These students tended not to engage in either of the forms of learning supports made available to them. Interestingly, 352 students out of the cohort utilised the individual communication as their major form of learning and support, and relied very little on the learning management system. The learning management and individualised communication group were also interesting. There were 52 of them. They did use the learning management system as well as the individualised communication. There were 47 erratic users of both, and 101 students were identified as disengaged. Look at the four categories of students. We can see that of the 352 students who primarily used the individualised communication, one student withdrew prior to census. Of the 52 students who used both forms of communication and learning supports, none of the students withdrew before census. Of the erratic users, where we had 47 students, 6 of those withdrew, and as might be expected, from the disengaged group of 101 students, 56 of those withdrew prior to census. When we explore patterns of communication in the 2 weeks leading up to census date, we can see that 375 of the students engaged in both weeks, talking with the tutor in one form or another. Of those, 27 withdrew. There was 160 students who only engaged once during that 2-week period, and of those, 30 withdrew. There were 17 students who didn't engage at all during those first 2 weeks, and of those 17 students, 6 withdrew. When we explored communication throughout the study period, so before and after census date, we could see that some students, in fact 334 students, maintained communication right the way throughout the study period. 67 students, or 14%, had limited or no engagement throughout the study period. And there was a cohort of students, in fact 88 or 18%, who only engaged with tutor support at assessment or around assessment due times. So they were very much driven by purpose and need. When we explored the outcomes of each one of the groups of students that formed around communication trends, we saw some interesting patterns. Those students who engaged in individual communication only tended to achieve quite strong results, although even with this extra communication and extra support, 36 did achieve a fail grade. Those students who engaged with both the learning management system and the individual communication also achieved strong results. Those students who had erratic use of both tended to achieve not such good results, and quite unsurprisingly, those students who engaged with neither form of support received a higher fail rate than the other 3 groups of students. Although not all students responded to the written feedback survey, those students who did responded quite favourably on a 5-point Likert scale, indicating that they really appreciated the responsiveness and the availability of the tutors, and that it was incredible useful support in supporting their learning experience. As might be expected, some students reported that the individualised communication had a direct impact on them completing their course or the outcome they received. Overwhelmingly, students indicated that the forms of communication improved the learning experience in all groups. What we learned from our exploration was that the vast majority of students engaged in and preferred one-to-one communication with the tutor. The majority of these students successfully completed the unit of study and continued into further study, but not all of them. Even with the additional support, some students failed. And we had a very low attrition rate at about 11%, which is significantly lower than the national average. And not surprisingly, disengaged students represented the largest attrition group by far. The second case study we explored was again a postgraduate course over a 7-week study period with 616 students starting the study period. They were all mature age. We employed 20 of our specially trained tutors, 1 unit coordinator, and again, 1 student success advisor per 150 enrolments. Once again, we saw the 4 groups of students emerge from the data. Some students, in fact 269, used individual communication only and very little engagement with teaching and learning forums. These students achieved approximately 6 telephone calls each over that 2-week period. Those students who used the learning management system and a little bit of the individual communication, 58 of them, participated more in the forums, but also engaged more with the one-to-one telephone calls as well. Again, we had the erratic users of both who achieved around about 2.5 telephone calls per student, and the disengaged students, a significant cohort in this group, 225 students who didn't really engage with the telephone communication and showed no engagement with the learning management system. The connection between engagement with learning supports and MELT was very pronounced in this case study. Those students who engaged with individual communication, 269 of them, all continued study right the way through to the census period. Those students, the 58 students who used both the learning management system and the individual communication, only 1 student withdrew prior to census. Erratic users, the 64 students who used a little bit of both but very erratically, 11 withdrew, and again, not surprisingly, those students who were disengaged from both forms of communication showed the largest attrition rate of 93 out of the 225 students. 229 students were active in communication in both weeks leading up to census date, and 4 of those students withdrew prior to census. There was a group of students who only communicated once in that 2-week period. There were 190 of them, and 14 of those students withdrew. And the students who had no engagement whatsoever during that 2-week period, the 197, 87 of those students withdrew. So we can see a pattern emerging in the amount of communication that students are having, how they're engaging with their learning supports, and their behaviour in choosing to withdraw. 46% of this cohort maintained engagement in communication with the tutors in one form or another across the whole study period. 30% of the students maintained their pattern of no engagement, and 24% of the students, or 121, only communicated with the tutor around assessment time, similar to our first case study. You can see some very interesting trends in student outcomes and success in this unit of study, and not surprisingly, those students who use more of their supports achieve better results. If we look at the students who use both the learning management system and the individual communication, 48 students out of the 57 achieved a distinction or a high distinction. We can see some very promising results for those students who prefer to use just the one-to-one communication. And of course, those students who don't use their communication or their learning supports at all represent the largest number of students who fail. Our survey results indicate strong support for individualised communication and learning management system support, with students rating very highly 4.7 and 4.8 the usefulness of the responsiveness of the tutor and being available to answer questions when they needed those questions to be answered. Remember, those students who engaged primarily in individual communication with the tutor indicated that that communication and that support had a direct impact on their completing their course and the outcome, and that it significantly improved the quality of their learning experience. Once again, in case study 2, similar to case study 1, the majority of students engaged in and preferred one-to-one communication. But not all students. Some preferred to use all their resources available to them. The majority of these students successfully completed the unit, but not all. The majority of these students continued in their studies. Again, this unit showed a very low attrition rate, only 17%, which is again significantly lower than the national average. Drawing conclusions from the 2 case studies, we can see that the majority of students across both case studies chose telephone communication as their preferred mode of communication with their tutors. Those students who engaged in personalised communication were much more likely to remain enrolled and complete the unit of study and achieve a satisfactory outcome. This research has shown that there is strong student support for individualised communication in addition to the supports that are already in place. I wish you well for the rest of the conference, and if you do have any questions, I will be available online. Thank you very much.